to the first Golden Gate Gab webinar. And what we hope this will be is a bi-monthly webinar series on topics of interest and inspiration to you, current members, and those living within the biosphere. It's a 28,000 square mile region, so it's pretty large, and we know there's lots of people living and working in this region. My name's Sharon Farrell, and together with my colleague, Michelle O'Heron, we're serving as the interim Golden Gate Biosphere Network coordinators. The network's guided by a 7-person steering committee who represent federal, regional agencies, and nonprofit organizations. Many of you might know, but the Golden Gate Biosphere region is originally recognized by the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, UNESCO, and in the Biosphere Program in 1988. Our region's status is very evident, especially for those of you who live and work here, because of its significant ecological and cultural diversity. And while this diversity helps enrich our lives in many ways, it also gives us a front row seat to some of the most daunting challenges facing our region. And pending if you're a cup half empty or a cup half full person, it also lends itself to finding collaborative solutions, which is a focal point of our Biosphere Network. One thing that makes this biosphere region unique is it's the only UNESCO biosphere region in the country where land, sea, and the city meet, and it spans a diverse range of marine, coastal, and upland habitats in Marin, Sonoma, San Francisco, and San Mateo counties. There are also 2 other biosphere regions here in California, the Mojave and Colorado Deserts Biosphere Region and the Channel Islands Biosphere Region. And we'll be likely hearing from both of these regions in future webinars. So to today, I'm excited for today's conversation, in part because I spent a good part of my early summer living in 2 biosphere regions in Ireland. I witnessed how these were celebrated by the people living within them, how they can bring unique value, innovation, and programs to those regions. And I also had a chance to visit my childhood biosphere region, which I didn't know it was a biosphere when I visited it, from ages 3 till 12 in the Brighton and Hove area in southern England. I'm also really excited to have recently met Dr. Kelly Cerialo, the US Biosphere Network's coordinator and today's presenter. Kelly is one of those people who you start with a 30-minute call and find yourself completely immersed in a conversation that lasts over an hour. And I'm sure you have people in your life that are just like that. And she's inspirational and has so many things to offer. But before we jump into today's webinar, I'd like you to turn to the chat and take a moment to introduce yourself, your name, the organization or agency you're representing, and respond to the brief question, what inspired you to join today's webinar? And what are you interested in learning? And we'll be integrating some of your questions and others into today's program as we move forward. Kelly will kick off with a short 20-minute presentation, then she and I will spend the remaining time in conversation, and we'll wrap up with news about what's next. So with that, I'm thrilled to introduce Dr. Kelly Cerialo. Kelly is an associate professor and program coordinator in the Business and Hospitality Department in, let's see, which one? Oh, at Paul Smith College. She is the co-chair of UNESCO's Champlain-Adirondack Biosphere Reserve in New York and Vermont, and the coordinator, as I've already mentioned, of US UNESCO Biosphere Network. Also in 2024, she was appointed by the Director General of UNESCO to the International Advisory Committee for Biosphere Reserves due to all the expertise that she brings in thinking and acting in biospheres. So with that, Kelly, I'm thrilled that you're joining us. I'm going to turn it to you for your presentation, and then we'll reconnect and have a conversation. Thank you.
Sounds great. Thank you so much for the excellent introduction, Sharon, and pleasure to see all of you. Thanks again for taking time out of your day, especially lunchtime, to be with us today. So I'll share my screen to get started with what I have. And my main goal today is to really discuss 3 main aspects about biosphere reserves. So the presentation focuses on local impact, national partners, and then global goals. So we'll get started and I'll show you kind of an overview of how we're going to do that. So first, I'm going to provide a context about the Biosphere Reserve Program. I think that many of you are very familiar with it based on what Sharon has already said, and I had the opportunity to join a steering committee call with GGBN earlier this month, and it seems like a lot of the members are very well versed and already very well engaged within the network. But I'll share from the Secretariat perspective, really the overarching goals and the design of what the Biosphere program is. The goal of that will be to set the scene, to talk about how this actually plays out on a local scale. So as Sharon mentioned, I'm the co-chair from the Champlain-Adirondack Biosphere. So I'll be sharing some lessons and some challenges that we had in that biosphere, but also some recent successes. So with the hope that GGBN can learn from our mistakes, but also our early successes and recent successes. And then I'll switch gears to talk about the national level. So what we're doing now at the US Biosphere Network level, and more importantly, how GGBN can get involved with that. And then lastly, I'll talk about the wider network, our world network of biosphere reserves on the global level, and again, how GGBN can be engaged. I hope by the end of this, I will highlight plenty of opportunities for you to engage in some resources from the local, national, and international level that might be of use to GGBN. So a brief introduction about the MOB program. I'm going to go through this pretty quickly because I think most of you have a pretty good understanding of what it is. But again, this paints a picture of how this looks like in practice on the ground in each of our biosphere regions in the US. So the Biosphere Reserve Program was established in 1971. So we just recently celebrated our 50th anniversary. It was a pretty significant celebration for us that not only it's grown relatively fast, but the success and the partnerships we've built through this network. So the main goal of the Biosphere Reserve Program, and honestly, the reason I stay connected to it, it's built to improve human connection to nature. And I'm pretty sure if you're on this call, you probably share that passion. So I think it's a really important mission that we as humans should all be focused on right now, given the impending threats of climate change. But what's interesting about biospheres is that it's not a traditional protected area. The idea that humans live within this area and the integration of humans with nature is most important. What's really unique by design is that biospheres are meant to be interdisciplinary, right? So the idea that it integrates social sciences, natural sciences, indigenous knowledge, thinks about socioeconomics and education all in one, right? So it was built to do that. And as you know, many times that's not the case. We operate in silos. I can say that for myself. I do research in sustainable tourism, and I have my neat little sustainable tourism silo that I like to stay in. But by design, biospheres are trying to break down those silos and integrate different sectors to work together. And again, by design, it's meant to improve livelihoods and equity. When it comes to doing that in practice and on the ground, we all know the challenges of that. That sounds great on paper, but when you're actually doing that, it takes a lot of work and planning and strong partnerships and engagement to do that. One important piece is that biosphere reserves are voluntary and cooperative. You know, no one's forcing you to do that. We have no regulatory authority, especially around land use regulations. So the UNESCO MOB program has 4 overarching objectives. These are taken from the Lima Action Plan. This was the 10-year guiding strategic document that was drafted in Lima in 2015. We have our next World Congress that's drafting our next version. We're actually helping write it now, the action plan in 2025. The World Congress is taking place in China in September 2025. But these objectives have been our guiding light, if you will, of how we run and operate biospheres on the local level and also nationally. So first and foremost, conserve biodiversity. Second is building sustainable, healthy, and equitable societies. So I think that's a really important piece to highlight. It's not just a conservation organization. That's not the intent. It's meant to help, again, by design, a thriving economy and human settlements. The third is to facilitate sustainability, science, and education. So as you can imagine from UNESCO's acronym, education is a key piece to that. So in our work in biospheres, the local and national level, you'll see that root of education baked into it. And then lastly, to support mitigation and adaptation to climate change. So throughout the presentation today, I'll be sharing examples of what each of these objectives look like in practice. In addition to those overarching 4 objectives, the Biosphere program also has 3 main functions, meaning this is what you're supposed to do. These are the things that when you're running a biosphere, this is what you should be focusing on, hopefully. Conservation, right? So, and I want to highlight here, it's not just conservation of biodiversity and natural conservation, but also cultural. So they're making sure that there's a conservation of cultural diversity as well. economic development, making sure that it's sustainable socioeconomic development, and also that it's tied to environmental sustainability. And then lastly, logistics support. What this means is that they're coordinating research, monitoring, and education and training. So again, these are in practice what biospheres should be doing by design on the ground. And another aspect I just want to highlight too here, because this is something, as a member of the International Advisory Committee for Biospheres, I realized very quickly, zonation is a very big deal to when we're looking at new biosphere reserves and evaluating periodic reviews. We want to make sure that biospheres are just not all national parks, right? We love a good national park, but it's meant to be to have a core protected area that's, kind of the traditional protected area that we know that could be the national park. And then it has a buffer zone around it to protect kind of that natural area from human impact. And then a transition zone, which is that can have some more impactful industries in there. And so the reason I'm showing this again is that when we were reviewing some periodic reviews and also some new designations, zonation is a key part of that. So just something to consider. Luckily, Golden Gate has a strong zonation format, so I don't think this is an issue here, but something to consider if you're considering designating a new biosphere, that the committee looks very strongly at zonation. So why are biosphere regions important? So as you can imagine, I was just going over the functions and then also the objectives of biospheres, I was talking about some of the most challenging issues that we have in the world facing us today. But what's great about biospheres is that UNESCO likes to call biospheres as testing places for sustainable development. So the idea that you can test new ideas and new partnerships and learn from them within biosphere reserves. Another thing that I've seen play out very well in our biosphere is this idea of bioregionalism, right? So not thinking about strict borders. And for example, our biosphere in the Champlain-Adirondack is a transboundary. It's New York and Vermont. And so we don't think of ourselves anymore as New York and Vermont, even though sometimes we do, because the hiking tends to be better on the Adirondack side, on the New York side. But what we've tried to do is think with a bioregional lens and try to connect people across, our cultures, our two states. We have a lot of similarities, but we also have differences. But we've started sharing resources across our two states. A way we've done that successfully is through education. We now teach a shared course on bioregionalism and biosphere reserves between 3 universities, which I'll touch on later in the presentation. And then lastly, biosphere reserves are important because they promote local and regional actions to achieve the UN SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. So again, it's in my opinion, and at the UNESCO Secretariat level, we see biosphere regions as the key places to enacting the Sustainable Development Goals, but also acting as models for other areas. If we can test and figure this out here, how to improve human connection to nature and address the 17 SDGs, let's share this with others, even outside of biosphere regions. So here are the SDGs that I just mentioned. What's really interesting, I want to point this out, is that, as you know, if you're familiar with the SDGs, in 2030, they're reevaluating the SDGs. So in our action plan, as we're planning for the next stage of biosphere reserves, our next 10-year action plan, we're figuring out how to approach this, knowing that the UN is going to be looking at the SDGs to evaluate the progress, the indicators that they're using to assess it. So it's something that at the UN level and then also at the UNESCO level are thinking about how to integrate this in our next 10-year planning session. So I'm going to shift gears here. Now that I've covered an overview of the Biosphere program and kind of what the expectations are, I want to take a moment to highlight what this can look like on the ground. Again, I'm sharing an example of my local biosphere and the one I've had the most experience with, but there's hundreds of other biospheres that we can pull from experience, but I'm highlighting this because at the US level and the local level, we've encountered a share of challenges and have overcome them. And I feel like we're kind of out of the gate. We were in some sticky territory for a while as a biosphere. So I'll share some of that with you. So our biosphere, quite similar to you, was designated in 1989. I believe yours was in 1988. So as I mentioned, ours is 2 states. So it's the entirety of the Adirondack Park, portions of the Green Mountain National Forest, and then also consisting of the watershed of Lake Champlain. It's giant. It's just under 10 million acres. So as you can imagine, that's a giant area to think about in terms of conservation and thinking about climate change, mitigation and adaptation, but we're working on it. So one thing that was interesting, and one of the challenges that we went through, is that in our biosphere, we had strong opposal to the idea of having a UNESCO site, because the locals were afraid of land use regulation. They were afraid that they were going to see, blue helicopters from the UN flying in and saying, you can't do this with your land and you can't do that. So we had a period of inactivity for a very long time. In 1996, UNESCO designated us as inactive and gave us a warning that we need to start to pull, things together. So from 1996 to about 2016, we stayed relatively inactive. And then when it came for our periodic review to be submitted in 2016, that's when we really started to pull together what I'm going to be sharing with you today. And that's largely due to the work of Brian Housiel. Some of you may have had the opportunity to meet Brian. He was the former chair of the US Biosphere Network. He was my first co-chair with the Champlain-Adirondack, and honestly, my mentor. Everything that I've learned about biospheres is from Brian. And he was really the energy that it took to reinvigorate the biosphere and to do it in a way that didn't raise red flags from the locals. And I'm highlighting Brian, but I can share this because I've done a lot of work in biospheres internationally, and it usually is one person, one Brian, that it takes to get a biosphere fanatic, if you will, that will push and share the value and communicate the value in such a convincing way that it rallies others and rallies partners. And Brian did that so well. And thankfully, because of his work, we were able to keep the designation. So now our biosphere is a much different story. So it's now housed under the Lake Champlain Basin Program, which has provided an incredible amount of capacity and resources to us. The Lake Champlain Basin Program also has another program, the Champlain Valley National Heritage Partnership, that receives funding from the National Park Service. So that has brought a lot of capacity to our biosphere. The way that we function, our governance structure, we have a 16-person steering committee. We meet on a monthly basis. The monthly meetings are very important. I want to emphasize this. This has changed our ability to share knowledge and information across the biosphere. And we open it to others. If they want to join and just listen in, we've taken an approach, the more the merrier, because we're still building partnerships. So we have two co-chairs, so it's myself and Jim Brannigan from the Lake Champlain Basin Program, and we have one paid part-time coordinator, Katie Dar, who has been a powerhouse of resources, and I swear she does the more work and the one day part-time that she has than most people do in 2 weeks. So she's been an incredible resource to build capacity across the network. Since 2016, we've also built a cabin youth board. That has given us a lot of presence in the local community, and also a lot of research on climate change and a variety of other topics like sustainable tourism in our region. So the youth board has been critical in allowing that to happen. We have a twinning agreement with the Frontenac Arch Biosphere Network. I'm sharing this with you because Sharon recently mentioned to me that you may have a relationship with the sister park, the biosphere that she mentioned in Brighton, the Living Coast Biosphere. The twinning agreement that we have with the Frontenac Arch Biosphere is also part of the reason for our success. We followed their model. We changed our name because they had Frontenac Arch Biosphere Network, and we realized that reserve can be pretty exclusive instead of inclusive. And we followed their model in terms of governance, their meetings, and really just allowed us, they allowed us insight into how to run a biosphere effectively and how to really mobilize partners. So I strongly recommend finding a twin or a sister to work with as you're building the network. We've also recently joined the World Network of the Mountain Biosphere Reserves, which has provided a lot of resources into our specific geographic features. So I highly encourage, and I know that you're members of the Island and Coastal Biosphere Reserves, which is a great resource. So I'm keeping an eye on the time here. So one thing I wanted to highlight, a recent success that we had that's pretty unique in the Champlain-Adirondack Biosphere is that through the Champlain Valley National Heritage Partnership, CVNHP, we were able to create a sub-grants program. It was roughly around $275,000, and it supported 10 projects in our region. What was interesting is that each of the projects had to focus on the goals of the biosphere. empowering youth, connecting people in nature, and storytelling for a sustainable future. What this did was, fortunately, it helped build our partnerships. I mean, what better way to make friends than to give money? So we now have an amazing group of 10 partners that have joined, the Champlain-Adirondack network, but also have now learned how to communicate the value of a biosphere. So it's really spread through the sub-granting program. So it was really cool to see that come to light. I understand that sub-granting programs might not be available right away, but I wanted to share this because it was a really unique model that has taken our biosphere kind of onto another level that we weren't anticipating. So another project I'll highlight, and I'm keeping an eye on the time because I do want to cover some more about the US Biosphere Network overall. One of the most successful projects that we've been working on recently, this comes out of the State University of New York's College of Environmental Science and Forestry. So it's a climate atlas. It's a transboundary climate atlas with the Champlain-Adirondack and the Frontenac Arch Biosphere. It's designed to share climate data across our 2 biospheres. And the goal of this is to inform policy and decision-making around climate change mitigation and adaptation. The great thing is we received a grant from UNESCO, the Venice office, to support this. And it's been an incredible resource to gain additional partners outside of the biosphere. So I just wanted to share that kind of as a star project that has opened the door to a lot of funding opportunities and also additional partnerships. So looking forward, Cabin, as I said, has kind of really picked up momentum, I would say, in the last 2 years. We have focused a lot not only on our building our partners locally, but also internationally. Some of the things that we're doing locally to build partnerships is that recently UNESCO approached us to invite a very famous chef, Daniel Hume. He has a 3 Michelin starred restaurant in New York City called 11 Madison Park. UNESCO invited him to come up to our biosphere to talk about sustainable agriculture and to feature that in Biosphere Reserves. The goal was to highlight the importance of food systems and alleviating food deserts in Biosphere Reserves. And so that was an incredible opportunity that put us on the map, not only with the larger UNESCO Biosphere Network, but also to think about ways of discussing sustainable agriculture and biospheres. We have another program that we're working on now to support. It's called the Future Forest Reimagine Workshops. It's in collaboration. We're working with several partners on this, and it's relaunching in September. For the sake of time, I'm not going to go into it because I want to share some other projects, but it's thinking about connected landscapes and thinking about reimagining our forests, but more importantly, integrating Indigenous voices in the design of our forests in the future in the Northeast. Let's see, I'm keeping an eye on the time because I know I'm running short here, Sharon. So one other project I just want to highlight here is that I mentioned this earlier, but it's been a really interesting opportunity for me. I'm actually a professor full-time, as Sharon mentioned, at Paul Smith's. So in order to connect with youth in our biosphere and also to share the benefits of what a biosphere is across our youth network, we created a class that we're co-teaching right now. It's called Bioregionalism and UNESCO Biosphere Reserves. So we co-teach it with Paul Smith's College, the University of Vermont, and State University of New York's College of Environmental Science and Forestry. What's really great about the program is it connects students. So it's students from each of the 3 universities and professors from each of the three universities, and we put them in a class to problem solve about sustainable development issues. So it's a really interesting model of bioregional education and the benefits of a biosphere, and in our case, working across borders, across New York and Vermont. So I'm going to touch on some of the other things I have here later in the presentation. So I'll just end with the fact that one of the key factors in our success, and I know Sharon mentioned that you're working on a 3-year strategic plan. Early on, we developed a strategic plan with a facilitator, and that was a game changer for us, just to give us a clear direction of where we're headed, timelines, who's going to participate, and the partners that we didn't have at the table. That strategic plan was really informative and acted almost as a self-assessment to see who are we missing here. We have a lot of people at the time. We had a lot of people that were working in conservation, but we didn't have representatives from, say, the small business community. So we were more intentional after doing that self-assessment and making that plan to integrate the people that weren't at the table. Okay, so now that we've covered the local example, and I hope you learned some from the Champlain-Adirondack Biosphere, I want to share with you what we're doing right now on the national network, and how GGBN factors into that. So the map on the right that you see here is the 28 US Biosphere Reserves. So what we're doing and trying to do is to get you to kind of collaborate together and to share ideas and knowledge across these borders. So similar to what we're doing in the Champlain-Adirondack, is really knowledge sharing. So not just, focusing on your own local network, but connecting within the 28 biospheres and beyond. So in terms of the mission of the US Biosphere Network, so the main mission of it is to foster domestic and international connections among biospheres. And the idea, as I mentioned before, is to facilitate the sharing of best practices and to support their work in improving human connection to nature. And I think what's great, and from what I've heard from Sharon, is that GGBN already has a really good start with doing that. So I'll skip the vision statement for the sake of time. So I want to just highlight some things about the organizational structure of USBN, because oftentimes when I say US Biosphere Network, people are like, okay, but what is it? Like, how does it work? So I hope this slide, it's a lot of information, but I hope that it gives you a better understanding of how it's structured and, more importantly, how GGBN factors into it. So as I mentioned, there's 28 biospheres right now. Just a fun fact, 18 of the 20 biospheres are up for periodic review in 2027, including Golden Gate Biosphere Reserve. So that means they have to do their 10-year basically self-assessment of how they're meeting the goals of the MOB program, the Man Biosphere program. So you're not alone in the fact that you're going to be writing a periodic review in preparation for 2027. So just a heads up that there's a lot of you working on that. So in addition to being part of our network of 28, the Center for Large Landscape Conservation is USBN's fiscal sponsor. So we, as USBN, we don't have the 501c3 designation, but instead are partnering with the Center for Large Landscape. They've provided incredible capacity, incredible context to networks, and I'm sure most of you are familiar with their work through the Stewardship Network. They're just an incredible resource. So we're honored to be part of their network. The US Biosphere Network is a voluntary steering committee, so it's comprised of, we have a chair, we have 2 vice chairs, a secretary, and also, I'm missing something else, youth board representatives. So, but they're all on a voluntary basis. So there's one paid part-time coordinator, that's me. The goal is to eventually get a coordinator to be full-time in order to continue to build capacity across the network. We also have a youth board. Janelle Booker, who you see in the picture right here, has been an incredible resource to build out our USBN youth board. On the right, you see a picture of us at Euromob. We had the chance to go to the Euromob conference, which is the European Man and Biosphere Conference that was just held in Germany this past June. So it was great to bring everyone together and to see some people from our USBN network that I've never met in person before. In addition to our voluntary steering committee, the youth board, we also have a MOB focal point, Cliff McCready, who I think most of you probably know. Cliff has been an incredible resource at reinvigorating the entire network and providing site level support for biospheres to keep the designation and also to communicate the value of biospheres on a local level. So we work closely with Cliff as the focal point and with the Park Service. We host monthly steering committee meetings just for organizational purposes, but we also host, and I'd like to invite you to, we have quarterly Biosphere Working Group meetings. So what the Biosphere Working Group is that there's 28 representatives that are identified and they attend these meetings. And the goal of these meetings is to share not only the business that we're working on, but also opportunities for the biosphere. So I highly encourage you to attend some of those meetings. And I can give you the dates at the end of this. One fun thing that's happening right now, and again, adding a lot of capacity to what we're doing in the network level, is that we have 7 students from the University of Michigan School of Environmental Sustainability. So they're with us for 14 months, and they're doing research in US Biosphere Reserves. They've actually, I know some of them have actually come to Golden Gate. And they visited several other biosphere reserves. So we're looking forward to their findings to share what they found about what it really takes to get a biosphere off the ground and how to keep partners engaged. So one of the major things that we're working at the network level, and I want to share this with you, is that we're looking at opportunities for joint grant funding. So the idea that as a coordinator, I'm looking at, say it could be an EPA grant or a NIFWIF grant to say, okay, what biospheres can put in for this and how can we collectively write a grant together and distribute this money? So our goal is not just to build capacity for the network, but more importantly, to help support the sites as much as we can, financially and also with knowledge and resources and knowledge sharing I just mentioned. Okay. And lastly, we're hoping that within our national network that we're providing as many connections locally to other biospheres within the US, across the US, and then also internationally. And I'll share some ideas of how to do that shortly. So I'll touch on this really quickly, and then I'm going to transition to the next section. So this is the structure of USBN. So you'll see our steering committee here. They're elected by the Biosphere Working Group. So we also have subcommittees. So if you're looking to get involved, there's some subcommittees on communication that Katie Dar oversees, sustainable agriculture and climate change. So if you want to get help with some of those subcommittees, we'd love to have your input on that. Again, the Biosphere Working Group is the representatives from each of the 28 biospheres. And then the World Network of Biospheres is the large network of 759 biosphere reserves across the world. So it's our international community of practice that we work with. And on the right here is the MOB Secretariat. So that's the headquarters in Paris, who receive input from the US State Department, Cliff at the National Park Service, and also the USBN Steering Committee. So together, this is what really compromises and puts together the core of what US Biosphere Network is. And the great thing is that GGBN fits right in here. So, okay. So I'll skip over this one. So right now, in terms of the World Network, so I'm going to shift gears now that we've covered the local and the national level. I'm going to talk briefly about the World Network of Biospheres. So we currently just designated 11 more. So now we have 759 biosphere reserves in 136 countries in the world. Which is super exciting. It's growing year by year. It's great to see that progress. And again, these sites are recognized for their high biodiversity and for the potential to sustain equitable livelihoods. And I went over this earlier of really what characterizes a biosphere reserve. So they're large landscapes and seascapes with protected areas and private lands where people live and work. Again, they're not traditional protected areas by design. One thing that exists in the international network, and I see at the cabin level, the Champlain-Adirondack level, that's helped us immensely is our participation in the regional and thematic networks. And so our participation and attendance to Euromob has led to opportunities for grant funding, has led to joint collaborations with citizen science projects. So I really encourage you, as the network is building and as GGBN builds capacity, to try to attend and get involved. The US, North America is part of the Euromob network. So that's the one we would participate in. So if you have a chance, the conference is held every other year. It just happened in June in Germany. The next one is actually going to be in Canada in September 2026. So I highly encourage you, if you have a chance, to attend that, and it could open a door of resources for you. The second one, I mentioned this earlier, and I know that you're members of the Island and Coastal Network of BRs. If they have meetings, if they host them online or in person, strongly recommend attending them. The reason I'm saying that is that our participation at the Champlain-Adirondack level in the mountain biosphere, the World Network of Mountain Biosphere Reserves, has been more generative than the World Network, because it's a smaller group. We have shared problems and shared ideas. So I strongly encourage you to get involved with that if you can. Okay. So I'm almost finished here. I have about 2 more minutes, and then I'm going to turn it over to Sharon for hopefully a more conversation style and to hear your thoughts and questions. So I just wanted to share some ideas how to engage new partners locally. So I know that the biosphere concept is abstract, and in our case in Champlain-Adirondack, it was very academic. We couldn't get anyone except people from universities to understand this concept. So Once we started to engage new partners, we learned some ideas of how to do this. The first thing that we did was we actually conducted an inventory. We called it a mapping of the Sustainable Development Goals, meaning what organizations are working on the 17 Sustainable Development Goals in our region, in our biosphere, and how can we work with them? We weren't trying to replicate what they were already doing. There's enough organizations in your region that are already doing amazing work. How can you use the work of the biosphere to support this? And so after that mapping, we saw, as I mentioned earlier, very clear gaps of who we didn't have relationships with and who we wanted to have relationships with. So I strongly suggest doing that if you haven't already. Another idea, and you're already doing it, the Golden Gate Gab. So these short format discussions and workshops to share knowledge and ideas. We also had meet and greets in cabin. We did that in the form of our annual meeting, but we invited the public, right? So we made sure that the public received invitations so they could come casually and informally to learn more about cabin and in your case, GGBN. I strongly suggest, if you haven't already, partnering with not Biosphere Reserves, with universities. We recently created a program called Biosphere in Your Backyard to share this concept of a biosphere reserve and to put it on a more understandable level. The goal is that this will eventually be integrated into K-12 school systems. But the benefit of working with colleges and universities and putting the terminology biosphere in your backyard, it's helped us, as I mentioned earlier, not only participate in different research activities locally and internationally, but also to communicate the value of a biosphere on an understandable and digestible level, not just on an academic level, right? So to be able to explain to an everyday citizen, why is this beneficial and why should you care about it? Some other ideas for engagement in terms of the socioeconomic sector, maybe destination management organizations. You know, we've worked with tourism partners and we can do a better job of that in cabin. We haven't successfully kept them involved, but that's an opportunity because they're dealing in our region. Tourism is a primary economic driver. So it's important to understand how to do that sustainably and how the biosphere can support that. And we've also tried to partner with small business associations to see, again, to create opportunities for sustainable economic development, not just strict conservation. And then another opportunity is to think about forming a GGBN youth board. The benefit of that is that it helps you plan for succession. It gets the message of the biosphere into different classrooms and different social settings, but it also helps you plan for the next generation of biosphere leaders. Okay, Sharon, I'm almost finished. I have 2 more slides. So some opportunities to stay connected with us at the USBN level. We want you to be involved. We want you to participate, and there's plenty of things to do that. So you can tune into, we have USBN Biosphere Bites. So it's a very similar format to this. It's actually 30 minutes. It's shorter than what we're hosting here, but it's hosted. We're kicking it back off in September 11th. The first one is going to be, it's at 12 o'clock. Eastern time, so 9 a.m. Pacific time. And the goal of it is to share ideas and resources across our network. So we would love to hear from you and do the amazing work that you're doing in GGBN. So please come and give a Biosphere Bites talk. As I mentioned earlier, please attend our quarterly meetings. Our next one is coming up the first week in September. I can send that to Sharon to share with you as well. We also have a USBN quarterly newsletter. So I can drop in the chat. I think Michelle might have it as well, of how to sign up for the quarterly newsletter. We would also love to feature your work. So if you're interested in contributing an article to that, please let us know and we're happy to add it. Another thing to mark your calendars for is that we're creating a series of workshops. It's called the Design the Next Decade workshops. The first one is called Making Real Progress in Biosphere Regions. This workshop series is designed because we know that we have 18 biosphere regions that are coming up for periodic review. So we're trying to help these biospheres prepare for that process. So the first one is really focused on engaging partners in biosphere reserves with the intent of using those partnerships to also assist with the periodic review process. So the first one is coming up September 26th from 10 to 1 p.m. Pacific time. Okay. Lastly, our opportunities to engage globally. First, I mentioned this earlier, definitely participate in the World Network of Island and Coastal Biospheres. I mentioned as well, explore the sister twinning agreement possibility with the Living Coast Biosphere Reserve. Euromob, again, a great resource if you have the opportunity to attend there. And lastly, the World Congress of Biosphere Reserves, that's held every 10 years, where we do our strategic planning for the entire world network of biosphere reserves. That's going to take place in September 2025 in Hangzhou, China. So if you're interested in going, that's the world stage to be at for biosphere reserves. The last slide I have here is just about resources. These are kind of tools of the trade that I use every day for biosphere reserves. So the MOB technical guidelines, our statutory framework of how we should be operating, the Lima action plan that's actually ending. That was our initial strategic plan. And I also wanted to plug the idea of connecting with MOB on social media. I often find out about the work that they're doing through their social media platforms before I get an email about it. So it's always good to follow them. They're very active on Instagram. I actually think more so than LinkedIn. So you can connect with them. This is their Instagram handle here. And I learn about all sorts of opportunities with them through their social media. So I'm going to end this portion of the presentation. I wanted to thank you again so much, Sharon, and the rest of the team for having me today. And I'm looking forward to building a sustainable future together, and happy to answer any of your questions.
Wow, thank you. You know, what's wonderful about your presentation is I had already thought about a number of questions I was seeking to ask you, Kelly, and you've touched upon many of them. I do have a few, and there's a few coming also from our colleagues. Let me just grab my... Did I lose my... Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Oh, well, I think I have a rather unusual still image of myself. One of the questions I have for you is, you touched upon this about how you begin to thoughtfully build out the network. We a lot of land managers, a lot of scientists, and as we think about those three primary goals, especially economic sustainability, do you have any advice or guidance about approaching building relationships and thoughtfully engaging those sectors in a network?
Yeah, so what we did, the first way we did it, we had an annual meeting in 2019 in Champlain-Adirondack, and we invited those organizations. So I'm thinking of the Lake Placid Business Association. We invited, the Regional Office of Sustainable Tourism. So the economic side of the biosphere that wasn't showing up to meetings prior to that, to give a presentation about their work at our annual meeting. And what that did was it made them sit through our presentation about what a biosphere is. They saw all the impressive people that were in the room that were doing great work about conservation and climate change mitigation, adaptation, and it started to connect resources. So I would say, as an early effort, at the very least, inviting them to share their own work, and then potentially identifying opportunities for them of how GGBN can support or leverage the work that they're already doing. So that could also be in the format of your Golden Gate Gabs. I was going to say chats, the Golden Gate Gabs. Invite them to come do one of them. They learn more about, what's, Golden Gate Biosphere Network. Why should I care about that? And it gives you an opportunity. And listen, they love sharing the work that they're doing, right? They always want to talk about their own work. So that's the first way. So, and yeah, the annual meetings, I think, that was the most generative for us, because we didn't just invite them to one. So for example, if they came to the first one and they presented at the first one, we would be intentional about inviting them to the next one and saying, thanks again for presenting last year. We'd love for you to come as an attendee and, emphasize why they'd be interested and why they would benefit to attend again. And luckily we were able to keep some of them still engaged.
Yeah, I really appreciate that, because I always think of partnerships as there's a give and there's a get, and trying to envision what is beyond, I think, where you touched upon, sometimes how do people understand what it really means to be a part of a biosphere region and network, and what do you get through that active participation? So it's something we're really thinking a lot about, which leads me to my second question. You mentioned that it was really helpful to develop your strategic direction at your regional level. And if you have one piece of advice to give us in developing ours, what might it be?
It needs to be bottom up, right? So it can't be top down, and it has to be for the benefit of the community and local citizens, because it's funny. So I've done, Sharon, I think I shared this with you before, but I've done work in biospheres in South Africa and Italy. I work closely with biospheres in Canada, all over Euromob. And the most successful ones that have strategic plans that are successful are bottom up. And the reason is that when they're top down, you see resistance. It's not aligning with community needs. So one example that I can give you of misalignment and why that doesn't work is that, a lot of my research focuses on sustainable tourism and the impact of tourism on local communities and biosphere reserves. And when you have a strategic plan that doesn't put the community needs first, especially related to tourism, you see conflicts. And so, for example, I remember seeing I'm not going to name the biosphere, but on a biosphere strategic plan to establish our biosphere as an international tourism destination, and recognition, something along those lines. And we had a similar goal at Cabin, but what it didn't account for in this biosphere when that went wrong was that the community needed to come before that, right? So the idea that, yes, we want tourists and that does stimulate the economy, but citizens needs should come first before thinking about tourist needs. So I would say in terms of your strategic planning, bottom up, first and foremost. I had taken some other notes too. I'm thinking about, we use the SDGs as guidelines. We were very intentional. I'm hesitant to say that now, knowing that there is a potential that they're going to be revised or rethought about in 2030, but we did use that as guidelines to think kind of more broadly in the UNESCO and kind of UN framework and how our efforts are fitting into that. I think the last thing, and I mentioned this earlier, Sharon, is that think about who's not at the table. That's what I kept saying, like with my co-chair at the time, Brian, when we were doing the first strategic planning session in 2019, like who are we missing here? And one group that we were missing and we still are missing is Indigenous population. We have not successfully and meaningfully engaged Indigenous population. And so that's something I'm acutely aware of, and we're working on how to do that. We just had our last monthly meeting, and that we had a great conversation about we've fallen short, right? And that was part of our strategic plan. Like, how are we going to do that? And now that we're changing, our methods in that and identifying ways that who's missing from our table and how are we getting them there. So, and that's not always easy to identify, because again, if we're thinking about a strategic plan that's benefiting the community, if somebody's missing, is it really strategic, right? So I think that's kind of the process. We used a facilitator, we paid a facilitator for this, and that's the process they took us through. And it was super valuable to think in that lens. So,
we've had similar conversations, and often we'll reflect which table, right? Is it us connecting with communities that perhaps may not have interest, resources, or us seeking their so yes, it's an area I think we can continue to build a stronger muscle and be much more intentional around and understanding around. Going to something you said about local and bottom up, one of the questions one of our colleagues has asked is if you could give more background on the biosphere in the backyard, right? Like right inside your home, so to speak.
Yeah. So that tagline came from Lake Champlain Basin Program. We were trying to figure out ways, as I mentioned, our biosphere was very academic and it was such an abstract concept. So we were trying to figure out ways, how can we what are languages, what is a language that we can communicate this in an understandable and digestible way? So the way that we introduced this concept was through a traveling exhibit. We did a series of 4 panels. And so we said, here, biosphere in your backyard, this is what a biosphere is. This is how it's, related to this area. This is why it matters. And this is, what it looks like in the future. And so that was kind of the initial kickoff to that concept. The idea has continued now through that sub-granting program that I mentioned before. So we've told each of the partners, the 10 partners that we funded through those sub-grants, about biosphere in your backyard. So the idea that when they're communicating it, what is a biosphere, they're using that language so it seems more approachable to the average person. I always, my litmus test is when I'm explaining this to my mom, is she like, what in the world? It's just, when I first told her about it, she thought it was a dome. She was like, aren't there one of those in Montreal? I think you took me to that dome in Montreal, the biosphere. I was like, yeah, Mom, that's it. So, but that's what Biosphere in Your Backyard was designed to do, to explain it in an easy, digestible format. And the traveling exhibit kicked it off. We've continued it with that, the sub-granting program. And now we're like building out social media for the fall, and we're doing like silly things to do. We have a sticker that says it. Now we're, putting it on water bottles and taking it in pictures across the biosphere. We also, as part of that, we recently got funding through CVNHP for a phenology project. So the idea is we're trying to identify, and essentially we've set up, this is the design, it hasn't happened yet, but this is the design. We've set up stands that say Biosphere in your backyard. You place your phone on there, and there's a program that catalogs. So basically, you take a photo of it, and over time, it catalogs change. So the idea is it's supposed to, monitor change over, phenology over time and climate impacts in that region. And so the Biosphere in your backyard branding is supposed to tie it to the idea that we as citizens are equally as responsible for thinking about and caring about the impacts of climate change in our region. So I'll let you know when that project's launched. We've had so many other things on our plate, but that's the next thing. Luckily, we have the funding. It's just now getting it off the ground and installed. So
yeah, I was struck when I was traveling in Ireland and England. You'd go to a restaurant, and it would be sometimes on the restaurant menu that you are dining in a biosphere. And I thought, well, what an interesting way. Or recyclable cups for getting coffee or tea. You pay €2, and the impetus for that, for getting the cup and then reusing it, came from understanding pollution issues in the biosphere, and the biosphere then supported, or the network supported, the local businesses in making those changes. And so the interrelationship and the kind of living within was much more prominent than I think. Here in Golden Gate, we have so many partners and so many organizations doing incredible things. Trying to think about our role and where we can be added value has definitely been a place where we've, really seeking to put more thought in. But I think that's where it is both a virtue and a vice to have so much already happening in our region.
I'm glad you brought that up, Sharon, because I can give an interesting example that might be inspirational with that. So the Tuscany-Apennine Biosphere that I work closely with, it's for the last 10 years, we've brought students there. They had a very similar problem. It's a good problem to have. Very active partners, but working on very different things and different needs, right? So each of the organizations had different needs and missions, all the things. You know how that is in your biosphere. So what they did was they created the branding, "We are the biosphere." So when you walk around, it's funny because it's written in English. It's not written in Italian. You'll see it on the back of a shirt. It says, "We are the biosphere." And they've branded it. So like they say, the local products, they'll say, biosphere branding, made in the Tuscany TEA, they'll say Tuscany-Apennine Biosphere. And what was interesting, they've created such a strong network and an interest in, I could potentially have this branding. I can be part of this. And it's almost like the cool kids club, right? So, and then locals were like, what am I missing out on? So they just were out of curiosity. What is all this? It's funny. Remember how I said earlier on, there's usually one, kind of a biosphere fanatic that's, communicating the benefits of it. This man's name was Fausto. So Fausto was communicating the benefits of it. And so at some point, people were just curious of what are we missing and why are we not a part of it? And now what's interesting, so they were a relatively new biosphere. They were established in they were a national park, and I guess they received the designation in 2015 because I was going there before they received the designation. Yeah, so I've been working with them 10 years. They received it in 2015. Long story short, now they've expanded their borders. And it was interesting because it started with that same problem. How do we get the partners together? What they did, and they were able to identify well, their role was a conduit. So how do we connect, right? So we're a conduit for grant funding. We're a conduit to connect these different organizations across conservation, across, economic development. And that's the role. The work of the biosphere is the work of the partners. And so if you can connect them and get them to sit at the same table and share idea and resources and maybe, help them with some joint grant funding, that's how to do it. So I think that I learned from the Tuscany-Apennine Biosphere of how to do that well. So.
Well, I think you're inspiring many of our audience to travel. I was amazed at how many places I went and learned that I was actually in a biosphere, which was really kind of cool. I just want to thank you.
They all need signs. Yeah. Like you said before, I wish there were like signs everywhere that you're entering the biosphere. Some of them have them, but not all. So yeah.
I really I appreciate, because what you are speaking to is all the scales, right? Like we've talked about, one of the value adds is we're connected to this national network and we're connected to an international network. And so how do you bring that to life? How do you share opportunity? How do you make connections for people to be able to see something they might gain from, but being a part of that. And you've just, through your introduction, Kelly, helped us do just that. So I want to thank you very much. And just anytime you want to come to Golden Gate, let us know. We'd love to have you. And for those of you that are joined us, please let us know. We're hoping to provide webinars on conversations like this, conversations that take advantage of working at that national or international scale, and things that can bring solutions to or have conversation around real needs here in our own biosphere. Michelle's dropped in the chat, I think, a couple of links for that. We've already Kelly's highlighted the USBN Biosphere Bites. We're having our member convening on September 27th. We'll be creating opportunities at that point in time to really dive deeper into our work plan. We're reaching out to others that might want to join, who bring different perspectives. So again, just want to thank you so much for joining us, taking your lunchtime to be a part of our conversation. And please reach out with any questions in the future. So with that, I just wish everyone a good day. Happy Tuesday, and we'll talk soon. Take care. And Kelly, again, thank you.
Thank you so much, Sharon. Thank you all.
Yeah, and we'll post this on our website. So really appreciate it.
Great. Thank you.
Take care. Talk soon. Bye-bye.